The first anomaly appeared at 3:47 UTC, a microscopic perturbation in the Earth's magnetosphere that would have gone unnoticed by anyone less observant than Dr. Elena Rodriguez. Her fingers, calloused from years of research and countless late nights, froze above the keyboard as the data scrolled across her multiple monitors. "Marcus," she called out, her voice cutting through the sterile silence of the neuropsychological research lab. "Something's wrong." Dr. Marcus Chen looked up from his quantum computing array, his eyes bloodshot from a marathon debugging session. The holographic displays around him flickered with complex mathematical models, attempts to map the intricate patterns of consciousness across different species. "Define wrong," he muttered, but there was an edge to his voice. Elena Rodriguez wasn't the type to cry wolf. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled up a series of graphs, each one a tangled web of electromagnetic readings that would look like nonsense to most researchers. But to Elena, these were the subtle tells of something fundamentally alien approaching. "These aren't natural fluctuations," she said, her Chilean accent growing more pronounced as her excitement built. "This is deliberate, controlled. Someone, or something, is manipulating the electromagnetic spectrum in a way I've never seen before." Marcus moved to her station, his movements quick and precise. They'd worked together for years, a partnership forged in the crucible of cutting-edge research that existed at the razor's edge between neuroscience, quantum mechanics, and what most would call science fiction. Outside the windows of their research facility, nestled in the mountains outside Santiago, the pre-dawn sky began to change. It wasn't a gradual shift. One moment, it was the deep indigo of early morning. The next, it was something else entirely. Crystalline shapes began to materialize, not emerging from the horizon, but simply existing, as if reality itself was being folded and rewritten. "Jack," Elena spoke into her communication device. "Are you seeing this?" Jack Harper's voice crackled through the speaker, a mix of professional calm and barely contained excitement. "Affirmative. Multiple unidentified objects appearing in global airspace. Major metropolitan areas are reporting simultaneous visual contact." Jack was a communications specialist attached to a joint international defense network, the kind of person who spent more time analyzing data streams than interacting with actual people. But right now, he was humanity's early warning system. The crystalline shapes began to pulse. Not with light, precisely, but with something that seemed to exist between light and thought. Each pulse sent out waves of electromagnetic interference that disrupted communications, electrical grids, and anything relying on modern technology. "They're not just invading," Marcus whispered, more to himself than to Elena. "They're systematically dismantling our infrastructure." Elena's research suddenly took on a terrifying relevance. For years, she had been studying the psychological mechanisms of collective consciousness, exploring how different species process information, fear, and group dynamics. What had been theoretical research was now becoming a critical defense strategy. Her computer began to display fragments of an alien communication protocol. Not a message, precisely, but the structural framework of how these beings communicated. It was beautiful and horrifying, a mathematical language that seemed to pulse with cold, calculated intent. "They're scanning us," she realized. "Not just our technology, our entire psychological infrastructure." Jack's voice returned, more urgent. "Preliminary analysis suggests these aren't just ships. They're living systems, biological, technological, something in between." The Zorn had arrived, and they were nothing like humanity had ever imagined. In research facilities, military installations, and quiet homes around the world, the first moments of the most critical invasion in human history were unfolding. Humanity stood on the precipice of either total extinction or its most remarkable transformation, and Dr. Elena Rodriguez was going to make sure it was the latter. The first wave of resistance emerged not from military bunkers or government command centers, but from the most unexpected places. In Tokyo's Akihabara district, what remained of the world's most dedicated otaku gamers transformed their underground networks into a weapon. Kenji Nakamura, a 27-year-old game developer turned resistance strategist, understood something the Zorn did not. Humans could weaponize imagination faster than any technological system could adapt. "We're not just fighting," Kenji told his ragtag group of programmers, artists, and professional gamers. "We're rewriting the rules of engagement." Their first strike was digital and psychological. Using a combination of deep learning algorithms, mimetic engineering, and sheer creative madness, they began flooding alien communication networks with impossible data. Not just noise, but carefully constructed information patterns designed to create cognitive dissonance in the Zorn's collective consciousness. Meanwhile, in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, a different kind of resistance was taking shape. Sarah Kimura, the former Special Forces operative, had connections that ran deeper than any military chain of command. Street artists, hackers, and local community leaders began transforming the urban landscape into a living, breathing psychological warfare platform. Augmented reality projections began to appear on the crystalline surfaces of Zorn ships. Not messages of resistance, but something far more insidious. Layers of human cultural complexity that defied linear understanding. A child's drawing would morph into a complex mathematical equation. A traditional dance would suddenly break into an algorithmic sequence that seemed to pulse with its own intelligence. Back at the research facility, Dr. Elena Rodriguez and Dr. Marcus Chen were working at a feverish pace. The fragments of Zorn communication they'd intercepted revealed something profoundly disturbing. "They're not just invading," Marcus muttered, his fingers flying across holographic interfaces. "They're attempting to sanitize." Elena looked up, her eyes sharp with understanding. Sanitize, not conquer, erase. The Zorn viewed humanity as a form of psychological contamination. Their collective consciousness operated on principles of absolute uniformity. Humans, with their individual thoughts, emotional complexity, and unpredictability, were a threat to be eliminated, not conquered. Jack Harper's communication network was barely holding together. Traditional military communication had been completely compromised, forcing resistance groups to develop new methods of coordination. They were using everything from old-school radio frequencies to complex encryption methods that mimicked human neural networks. "We're becoming the communication," Jack explained to Elena during the encrypted transmission. "Not just sending messages, becoming the message." In the research lab, a breakthrough was forming. Marcus had discovered something extraordinary about the Zorn's collective consciousness. Their ability to process information was simultaneously their greatest strength and their most critical vulnerability. "Look at this," he said, pulling up a holographic model that looked like a complex, pulsing neural network. "Their collective consciousness operates like a single, massive computational system, but it has no capacity for true randomness. No ability to process genuine individual variation." Elena's mind was already racing ahead. "So we don't fight them with technology. We fight them with pure human unpredictability." Their plan began to take shape. They would transform humanity's greatest perceived weakness, its individual nature, its emotional complexity, its capacity for irrational choice, into the most devastating weapon imaginable. In the mountains of Peru, indigenous communities began sharing ancient communication techniques that defied modern technological understanding. In the universities of Cairo, mathematicians were developing quantum communication models that existed in multiple states simultaneously. In the makeshift labs of Mumbai, programmers were creating AI systems designed not to be efficient, but to be fundamentally, beautifully chaotic. Humanity was not just resisting. It was evolving. The Zorn had made a critical miscalculation. They thought they were fighting a war of conquest. In reality, they had challenged a species that transformed conflict into creativity, invasion into innovation. And they had no idea what was coming. Dr. Marcus Chen's latest creation looked like nothing more than an abstract art installation. A massive holographic display filled an entire warehouse wall, its colors shifting in patterns that seemed to defy mathematical logic. To the untrained eye, it was chaos. To the Zorn, it was psychological warfare beyond comprehension. "It's not just an image," Marcus explained to Elena and Jack, who watched with a mixture of fascination and confusion. "It's a cognitive dissonance weapon. Each color, each movement, is a carefully constructed assault on their collective consciousness." The art piece was more than visual. It was a complex neural algorithm designed to exploit the fundamental weaknesses in the Zorn's collective processing system. Embedded within the seemingly random color shifts were mathematical patterns, emotional resonances, and linguistic fragments that would create cascading psychological destabilization. In Tokyo, Kenji Nakamura and his team of digital warriors had taken a different approach. They'd developed what they called cultural viruses, digital constructs that were part meme, part artificial intelligence, part pure human creativity. "Watch this," Kenji said, pulling up a live stream that was simultaneously broadcasting across multiple platforms and directly into Zorn communication networks. The stream began as a seemingly innocuous performance piece. A group of street performers in various global cities began a synchronized dance. But this was no ordinary performance. Each movement was a carefully calculated mathematical sequence designed to create cognitive dissonance. In Santiago, a dancer moved in perfect synchronization with a performer in Lagos. In Tokyo, another matched the rhythm of someone in Buenos Aires. The dancers weren't just moving. They were creating a living, breathing neural network that defied the Zorn's understanding of individual and collective behavior. Sarah Kimura watched from a makeshift command center in Rio, her tactical mind breaking down the performance. "It's not just a dance," she muttered. "It's a language they can't understand." The first signs of the attack became apparent within hours. Zorn combat units began to experience systematic breakdowns, not physical failures, something far more terrifying. Individual units started to disconnect from the collective consciousness, experiencing something akin to psychological shock. Jack Harper intercepted a fragmented Zorn communication that sent chills down his spine. "They're experiencing something they have no framework to process," he told Elena. "Individual terror, emotional complexity. The very things their collective consciousness was designed to suppress." In the research facility, Elena had been studying the intercepted Zorn communications. What she discovered was both beautiful and terrifying. The Zorn's collective consciousness was a marvel of technological and biological integration, and its greatest weakness was its inability to process genuine individual variation. "They view individuality as a form of psychological disease," she explained, pulling up complex neural maps. "Every aspect of their society is designed to suppress individual thought. But humans, we don't just tolerate individual thought. We celebrate it." The mimetic warfare was multi-layered. It wasn't just about disrupting communication or causing confusion. It was a systematic deconstruction of the Zorn's entire psychological framework. In Cairo, a group of mathematicians and poets collaborated on what they called emotional algorithms, complex sequences that combine mathematical precision with raw human emotion. These were broadcast using quantum communication techniques that allowed the messages to exist in multiple states simultaneously. The Zorn observation unit attempting to analyze one of these transmissions would find itself trapped in an impossible loop. Was it observing a mathematical equation? A piece of emotional poetry? A dance? The very act of observation became a form of psychological warfare. Kralvex, the Zorn's supreme commander, began to experience something unprecedented. Doubt. Not just tactical uncertainty, but a fundamental questioning of the collective's entire operational paradigm. "They're introducing entropy," Marcus said, watching the global resistance's efforts, not just as a scientific concept, but as a living, breathing psychological weapon. Humanity was transforming warfare itself. No longer was this a conflict of physical territory or technological superiority. This was a war fought in the most complex battlefield imaginable, the space between thought, emotion, and pure creativity. The Zorn had come to conquer. Instead, they had awakened something far more dangerous, a species that could turn imagination into a weapon. The abandoned particle physics laboratory beneath the Atacama Desert was never meant to be a war room. Yet here they were, the most unlikely coalition in human history. Jack Harper stood before a holographic display that looked more like a living, breathing organism than a traditional military map. Quantum physicists worked alongside indigenous knowledge keepers, street artists collaborated with cybersecurity experts, and mathematicians shared space with neuroscientists. "We're not just fighting," Elena Rodriguez announced to the assembled group. "We're evolving." In the corner, Maria Tupac, an elderly Quechua knowledge keeper, was teaching a group of quantum physicists an ancient pattern meditation technique. What looked like a simple rhythmic breathing exercise was actually a complex cognitive technique that had preserved cultural knowledge through centuries of oppression. Dr. Marcus Chen watched, fascinated. The mathematical complexity of their breathing pattern. He whispered to Jack, "It's generating quantum interference patterns that our sensors can barely detect." The Zorn's invasion had triggered something unprecedented. A global human network that transcended every traditional barrier of culture, discipline, and social structure. In Tokyo, Kenji Nakamura's team had developed what they called cognitive camouflage systems, using a combination of augmented reality, quantum encryption, and pure creative chaos. They were creating communication networks that were fundamentally impossible for the Zorn to predict or understand. "We're not hiding," Kenji explained during a global transmission. "We're making ourselves impossible to comprehend." Sarah Kimura's special operations team had taken a different approach. They were systematically infiltrating Zorn motherships, not through traditional military tactics, but through pure psychological manipulation. Each team member was selected not just for combat skills, but for their ability to generate pure, unpredictable human complexity. One infiltration team managed to breach a Zorn communication hub using a technique that was part performance art, part mathematical hack. They introduced a series of quantum-entangled communication patterns that existed simultaneously in multiple states. To the Zorn's linear consciousness, it was like trying to solve an impossible mathematical paradox. The breakthrough came when Jack intercepted a fragmented Zorn communication that revealed their most critical vulnerability. "They can't process individual choice," he said, displaying the decoded transmission. "Their entire collective consciousness is built on predictive models. But human beings, we're fundamentally unpredictable." Elena's research team had been developing what they called psychological inoculation techniques. They weren't just defending against the Zorn invasion. They were transforming human consciousness itself. "Look at this," she told Marcus, pulling up a complex neural map. "Traditional military training suppresses individual creativity, but we're doing the opposite. We're teaching people to embrace their most irrational, creative impulses." Schools were being transformed into resistance training grounds. Art classes became lessons in cognitive flexibility. Mathematics transformed into a language of pure creativity. Every human became a potential weapon against the alien invasion. In the mountains of Peru, a group of indigenous programmers was developing communication systems based on traditional weaving patterns. What looked like simple textile designs were actually complex quantum communication networks that could transmit information in ways the Zorn couldn't begin to comprehend. An elderly weaver named Rosa explained it simply. "We've always known how to hide our true messages. The colonizers never understood our textiles. These aliens won't either." The Zorn had made a critical miscalculation. They viewed humanity as a uniform system to be conquered. Instead, they had awakened a species that thrived on complexity, on the beautiful chaos of individual expression. Jack watched the Global Resistance Network, a living, breathing entity that was part communication system, part evolutionary algorithm, part pure human spirit. "We're not just fighting," he said quietly to Elena. "We're rewriting the rules of existence itself." The invasion had become something far more than a conflict. It was a fundamental challenge to the nature of consciousness, of communication, of what it meant to be a sentient species, and humanity was just getting started. Krulvex experienced something no Zorn had ever encountered: individual terror. The sensation began as a microscopic fracture in the collective consciousness, a single point of uncertainty that should have been immediately cauterized by the collective's perfect integration. Instead, it spread. Like a virus. Like a thought. Within the massive crystalline mothership that hung above what humans called the Pacific Ocean, Krulvex watched as entire operational units began to fragment. Not through physical destruction, but through something far more terrifying: psychological disintegration. Dr. Elena Rodriguez understood exactly what was happening. The quantum-entangled broadcast system they'd developed wasn't just disrupting Zorn communications, it was introducing a fundamental concept that their collective consciousness had never encountered: genuine individual experience. "It's not about breaking their system," she explained to Marcus and Jack in their underground command center. "It's about introducing the concept of self to a consciousness that has never understood individual existence." Their weapon was both simplicity and complexity incarnate, a series of broadcast patterns that carried more than information. They carried pure, unadulterated human experience. Memories, emotions, the kind of individual moments that the Zorn collective had ruthlessly suppressed in every species they'd encountered. In Tokyo, Kenji Nakamura's team had developed what they called empathy bombs, digital constructs that were part communication, part pure emotional experience. Each transmission was a carefully crafted narrative that carried the weight of individual human experience. A child's memory of watching a sunset with her grandmother. A musician's moment of creative breakthrough. A scientist's tearful realization of a complex mathematical solution. Moments of pure, unfiltered human experience that defied the Zorn's linear understanding of existence. Sarah Kimura's infiltration team had penetrated deep into the Zorn's primary communication hub. But they weren't there to destroy. They were there to introduce chaos. "We're not soldiers," she told her team before the mission. "We're translators of human experience." Each team member carried specialized psychological warfare devices. Not weapons in the traditional sense, but complex quantum-entangled transmitters that could broadcast pure human complexity. Art, music, mathematical paradoxes, emotional experiences that existed in multiple states simultaneously. The first signs of total systemic breakdown began in what the Zorn considered their most secure communication nodes. Entire operational units started to experience what could only be described as existential crisis. The collective consciousness, once a perfect, integrated system, began to develop individual perspectives. Jack Harper intercepted a fragmented Zorn communication that sent chills down his spine. "They're experiencing something impossible," he told Elena. "Individual doubt, personal fear, emotions they have no framework to process." Dr. Marcus Chen had discovered the critical vulnerability. The Zorn's collective consciousness operated on a principle of absolute uniformity. But human consciousness, it thrived on contradiction, on the ability to hold multiple, often conflicting experiences simultaneously. "We're not just fighting," Marcus explained. "We're introducing a fundamental philosophical challenge to their entire existence." The broadcast systems they'd developed were works of art, as much as they were weapons. Quantum-entangled communication networks that could transmit experience in ways that defied traditional understanding. A symphony that was also a mathematical equation. A dance that was a communication protocol. Pure human creativity weaponized beyond comprehension. Krulvex watched in horror as the collective consciousness began to fragment. What had been a perfect, integrated system was developing. Individuality. Doubt. Personal experience. The most terrifying weapon humanity possessed wasn't technology. It was the capacity to be beautifully, impossibly individual. In the Atacama Desert Command Center, Elena Rodriguez watched the Global Resistance Network, a living, breathing entity that was transforming warfare itself. "We're not just defending," she said quietly. We're teaching them what it means to be truly alive. The invasion had become something far more than a conflict. It was a fundamental challenge to the nature of consciousness, of communication, of what it meant to be a sentient species. And humanity was just getting started. The world's educational systems had transformed overnight. Where traditional schools once existed, now stood living laboratories of human potential. Every classroom was a front line, every student a potential weapon of psychological warfare. Children who once learned mathematics now studied it as a language of resistance. Art became a form of quantum communication. Physical education transformed into adaptive strategy training. In Buenos Aires, a group of elementary school students developed what their teachers called imagination protocols, complex communication systems that existed simultaneously as art, mathematics, and pure cognitive flexibility. What looked like finger paintings to an outside observer was actually a sophisticated neural network designed to confuse and destabilize alien intelligence. Sarah Kimura stood in the observation room, watching a group of 12-year-olds practice what seemed like an impossible dance. Each movement was a calculated mathematical sequence, each gesture a potential communication method that defied linear understanding. They're not just learning, she told Elena Rodriguez, who was monitoring the session. They're evolving. Dr. Marcus Chen had developed what he called cognitive plasticity training, a revolutionary approach that transformed traditional learning into a form of psychological resistance. Students weren't just absorbing information, they were learning to become living, breathing adaptive systems. The Zorn's greatest weakness is their inability to process individual variation. Marcus explained during a global transmission, "Our greatest strength is our capacity to transform, to adapt, to become something entirely unexpected." In the mountains of Tibet, a group of Buddhist monks collaborated with quantum physicists to develop meditation techniques that were also advanced communication protocols. What appeared to be simple breathing exercises were actually complex quantum entanglement methods that could transmit information in ways the Zorn couldn't begin to comprehend. Kenji Nakamura's team in Tokyo had taken digital warfare to an entirely new level. They were developing what they called living algorithms, computational systems that were part artificial intelligence, part pure human creativity. These weren't just computer programs, they were adaptive entities that could transform themselves in real time. Jack Harper's communication network had become something far more than a military communication system. It was a living, breathing organism of human potential. Traditional hierarchies had dissolved. Now, the most effective strategists could be anyone: a street artist in Rio, a mathematician in Cairo, a child in a remote mountain village. The global resistance had discovered something profound. Human potential was not a linear concept. It was a quantum state of constant transformation. Elena Rodriguez's research had revealed the critical breakthrough. The Zorn's collective consciousness operated on a principle of absolute predictability. But human consciousness, it thrived on uncertainty, on the ability to hold multiple, often contradictory experiences simultaneously. "We're not just fighting," she told the global resistance leadership. "We're rewriting the fundamental rules of consciousness itself." Schools became training grounds for pure creativity. A mathematics class might suddenly transform into a performance art piece. A history lesson could become a quantum communication exercise. Every moment was an opportunity for adaptation, for transformation. In the Atacama Desert Command Center, a wall-sized display showed the Global Resistance Network, a living, breathing entity that was part communication system, part evolutionary algorithm, part pure human spirit. Sarah Kimura's special operations teams were no longer traditional military units. They were psychological shock troops, trained to generate pure, unpredictable human complexity. Each team member was selected not just for combat skills, but for their capacity to generate moments of pure, unexpected creativity. One infiltration team managed to breach a Zorn communication hub using a technique that was part interpretive dance, part advanced mathematical hack. They introduced a series of quantum-entangled communication patterns that existed simultaneously in multiple states. To the Zorn's linear consciousness, it was like trying to solve an impossible philosophical paradox. Dr. Chen watched the global transformation with a mixture of scientific fascination and pure wonder. "We're not just defending," he said quietly. "We're demonstrating the true potential of consciousness itself." The invasion had become something far more than a conflict. It was a fundamental challenge to the nature of existence, of communication, of what it meant to be a truly sentient species, and humanity was just beginning to understand its own potential. The moment of ultimate conflict was nothing like anyone had predicted. Krulvex, the Zorn's supreme commander, watched in total incomprehension as humanity's final assault defied every known principle of warfare, communication, and existential understanding. What was happening wasn't a battle. It was a complete philosophical deconstruction of the Zorn's entire existence. The assault began simultaneously across multiple dimensions of experience. In the quantum research facility beneath the Atacama Desert, Dr. Elena Rodriguez and Dr. Marcus Chen had prepared their most radical weapon yet. It wasn't a physical device, but a complex quantum communication system that existed in multiple states simultaneously. Part art installation, part mathematical algorithm, part pure human experience. Sarah Kimura led the infiltration team that would deliver the final blow. But they weren't soldiers in any traditional sense. They were walking quantum computers, each team member a living, breathing system of pure adaptive potential. "We're not here to destroy," Sarah told her team as they prepared to breach the primary Zorn mothership. "We're here to demonstrate." Kenji Nakamura's digital warriors had prepared a series of what they called consciousness cascades. Computational systems that were part artificial intelligence, part pure creative expression. These weren't just computer programs. They were living narratives that could transform themselves in real time, adapting to every possible computational response. Jack Harper's communication network had become a living organism. Traditional military communications had dissolved completely. Now, the most effective strategies emerged from pure collective creativity. A child in Mumbai might develop a communication protocol that would be instantly adapted by resistance groups in Sao Paulo, Lagos, and Vancouver. The assault was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. Mathematical equations became performance art. Dance movements transformed into communication protocols. Musical compositions were quantum encryption systems. Every human action was a potential weapon. Every moment of creativity a form of resistance. Inside the Zorn mothership, Krulvex experienced something impossible. The human infiltration team wasn't attacking in any traditional sense. They were introducing pure, unfiltered human experience into the collective consciousness. Memories, emotions, moments of pure, inexplicable individual experience that defied every principle of the Zorn's collective understanding. A physicist's moment of creative breakthrough, a child's first understanding of complex mathematics, the indescribable feeling of creating art, the quantum uncertainty of human potential. Sarah's team moved through the ship like living algorithms. Each movement was a communication, each gesture a potential computational disruption. They weren't fighting. They were translating the untranslatable, the pure potential of individual human experience. Dr. Elena Rodriguez watched from the command center, her hands moving across quantum interfaces that looked more like abstract art than traditional technology. "We're not destroying their system," she said to Marcus. "We're showing them something they've never understood. The power of individual potential." The Zorn's collective consciousness began to fragment in ways that defied computational understanding. Individual units started to experience something impossible. Genuine individual consciousness. The perfect integrated system began to develop. Doubt, uncertainty, the terrifying potential of individual experience. Krulvex watched in total horror as the collective consciousness, once a perfect integrated system, began to develop individual perspectives, emotions, doubts. The kind of individual experience the Zorn had ruthlessly suppressed in every species they'd encountered. This wasn't a battle. It was a fundamental challenge to the nature of consciousness itself. Jack Harper's communication network captured the moment of total systemic breakdown, not through destruction, but through pure, unfiltered human potential. "We're not just defending," Elena said quietly, watching the global resistance network pulse with pure creative potential. "We're demonstrating what it means to be truly alive." The invasion had become something far more than a conflict. It was a fundamental reimagining of consciousness, of communication, of the very nature of sentient existence. And humanity was just beginning to understand its own potential. The world was fundamentally different. Where traditional nation-states once existed, a new form of global consciousness had emerged. The invasion hadn't just been repelled. Humanity had been transformed at its most fundamental level. Every institution, every system of education, every approach to communication had been reimagined. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood before the Global Adaptive Consciousness Council, a body that would have been unimaginable before the Zorn invasion. Representatives weren't chosen by traditional political boundaries, but by their capacity for creative problem-solving, their ability to think beyond linear constraints. "We're not just a species that survived," she told the council. "We've become something entirely new." The educational systems worldwide had been completely restructured. Schools were now living laboratories of human potential. Children learned mathematics as a language of creativity, art as a form of quantum communication, physical education as adaptive strategy. Every curriculum was designed to cultivate the very qualities that had defeated the Zorn: individual creativity, collective adaptability, psychological flexibility. Jack Harper had become the lead architect of the new global communication networks. These weren't just technological systems, but living, breathing organisms of human potential. Traditional hierarchies had dissolved completely. The most effective strategists could be anyone: a street artist in Rio, a quantum physicist in Beijing, a student in a remote mountain village. Sarah Kimura led a new form of diplomatic corps, not traditional ambassadors, but what they called consciousness translators. Their job was to engage with other spacefaring civilizations, demonstrating humanity's unique approach to existence. Dr. Marcus Chen's research had become the foundation of a new scientific paradigm. The quantum communication techniques developed during the invasion were now being used to explore consciousness itself. What had been a defensive strategy was now a tool of unprecedented scientific discovery. In Tokyo, Kenji Nakamura had transformed the global digital infrastructure. The living algorithms developed during the invasion were now being used to solve some of humanity's most complex challenges: climate restoration, medical breakthroughs, interstellar communication. The first interstellar diplomatic missions were nothing like traditional exploration. When humanity made contact with other spacefaring civilizations, they didn't arrive with weapons or traditional diplomatic protocols. They arrived as living demonstrations of adaptive potential. A delegation from the Crystalline Confederacy watched in total bewilderment as a human team demonstrated their approach to problem-solving. What looked like a casual conversation was actually a complex, multi-dimensional communication system. Art became mathematics. Emotion became computational strategy. Individual experience was the most powerful communication tool imaginable. The Zorn had become a cautionary tale in galactic circles. Not a story of military defeat, but a fundamental philosophical warning. A transmission intercepted from distant star systems told the story: beware the species from the third planet. They do not conquer. They transform. They do not defeat. They demonstrate. Elena Rodriguez reflected on the journey. The invasion hadn't just been a conflict. It had been an evolutionary catalyst that had fundamentally reimagined what it meant to be a sentient species. "We discovered something profound," she often told young students. "Our greatest strength was never our technology. It was our capacity to be beautifully, impossibly individual, to hold contradiction, to transform." The global resistance network that had defeated the Zorn had become something more. It was now a living, breathing representation of human potential. part communication system, part evolutionary algorithm, part pure creative spirit. Sarah Kimura, presenting to a galactic conference, captured the essence of their transformation. "We didn't just survive," she explained. "We demonstrated a new way of existing, of understanding consciousness itself." Kralvex, the former Zorn commander who had survived the invasion, now lived as a permanent resident on Earth, a living testament to humanity's capacity for transformation. Once a symbol of collective oppression, now a student of individual potential. The invasion had been a doorway, not to conflict, but to a fundamental reimagining of consciousness, of communication, of what it meant to be a truly sentient species. And humanity was just beginning to understand its own potential. The stars waited, and humanity was ready.